The photograph named The Vulture and the Little Girl is perhaps the most shocking photograph ever taken. It shows the girl emaciated and starving, under the watchful eye of a vulture, as if it is waiting for the young child to die. The photograph was taken by Kevin Carter, a South African photojournalist who was covering the Second Sudanese Civil War, and the photograph won the Pulitzer Prize. It is hard not to be moved by the image, but few people know the story behind such a tragic photo. For starters, the subject of the photograph is not a girl, but a boy named Kong Nyong. He and his family had been caught up in the Second Sudanese Civil War, fleeing the violence. Millions were displaced by fighting between the Sudanese government and the rebels of the South People's Liberation Army. Those in the south of Sudan had previously fought and obtained the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region. However, the discovery of oil fields in the south and the imposing of Sharia law on the largely Christian south by the government led to civil war. Horrific war crimes were committed by both sides as civilians struggled to survive. In 1989, Operation Lifeline Sudan was created by the United Nations to deliver aid to the civilians affected by the famines and conflict, regardless of their political leanings. This was achieved through agreements with the Sudanese government and rebel forces, as to access the respective controlled areas would be dangerous without their prior approval. Kevin Carter was sent to Sudan as a photojournalist to help raise awareness and thus gain support for Operation Lifeline Sudan. Carter had made his name photographing the cruelty of apartheid, taking photographs up close with the danger and exposing the grim reality. During his time in Sudan, Carter spent a few days touring villages, witnessing and recording the plight of the countless starving people. During this time, he was surrounded by armed Sudanese soldiers, monitoring his every move. Carter was flown to the village of Ayid to photograph people attending a UN feeding station. There he photographed the starving crowds of people at a feeding station, many of whom had gathered on the runway to get food as soon as possible. After taking some photographs, Carter walked away from the feeding station into the bush. He heard the sounds of quiet sobbing and began to follow the sound. He soon found Kong Nyong, heavily emaciated from starvation, attempting to crawl towards the feeding station. It was at this point that Carter started to photograph the boy. Carter photographed the vulture and the boy for several minutes. As he was taking the photographs, one of the nearby vultures that was feeding on a pile of manure entered the frame, about 20 meters or so behind the boy. He hoped that an even more dramatic shot could be made with the wings spread out, but this never happened. After a few more minutes and realizing he could not get the desired shot, Carter scared the bird away and went and sat under a tree where he wept. He was quoted as saying to another photographer with him he had taken an amazing photograph, but that he could not help but think about his own child enduring such suffering. The plane soon left, needing to make another stop and to obtain approval from a rebel leader for the group to stay a few more days. The photograph was published in the New York Times in March of 1993 and was soon awarded the Pulitzer Prize. It drew many letters of concern about the fate of Kong Nyong. A special editorial follow-up was published, which stated that the child recovered enough to resume their journey to the feeding station after the vulture had been chased away, though it did not confirm whether the child had survived or not. Kong Nyong did indeed make it to the feeding station, and he managed to survive the famine. In looking further into the picture, you can see a plastic bracelet on his wrist, which shows he had already been diagnosed as malnourished, ready to be taken care of. Kong Nyong would live for another 14 years, though sadly died of malaria-induced fevers according to his family. The photograph soon drew criticism, as did Carter, for not doing more to help the starving boy. Rather than helping him make his way to the feeding center, Carter spent 20 minutes taking plenty of photographs before leaving the child to an unknown fate. Many critics compared Carter to the vulture, exploiting and preying on a vulnerable child. However, the United Nations had asked the photographers to have no contact with the famine victims. In order to avoid the spread of disease, and potentially making the situation far worse. There is also the question as to the role, if any, a photojournalist ought to take. Should they interfere in the events they are documenting, or merely attempt to show the rest of the world what is happening? In this instance, Carter opted to take the photograph and leave Kong to make his own way to the feeding station without assisting him at all. In July of 1994, just 2 months after winning the Pulitzer Prize, Carter took his own life. In his final note, he made reference to the events he had witnessed and photographed, such as starving or wounded children, trigger-happy madmen, often police officers, of killers and executioners. Carter's photograph without a doubt drew the world's attention to the famine in Sudan. In response, the world increased aid and support to the region. The Second Sudanese Civil War would continue until 2005. Yet, it is this photograph of Kong Nyong that remains synonymous with the conflict. It is hard not to be moved by the photograph, whether you see it as exploitative or as perfect symbolism for the hardships that the innocent suffer at the hands of the vultures of the world. Some have interpreted the photograph as containing two vultures, the one captured on film and the one behind the lens. Others have pointed to the burden of photojournalists in exposing the horrors most of us will never thankfully experience firsthand. Carter's intentions were only to increase awareness about the bloodshed and famine occurring in Sudan. Perhaps it would have been better for Carter to provide elaboration on the situation behind the photograph, as well as the limitations placed upon him. A comparison can be made between the photograph of Kim Phuc, the Napalm Girl. The man who captured the photograph of the Napalm Girl is named Nick Ut. He has remained in close contact with Kim since taking the photograph and developed a close relationship. These two different approaches to photojournalism ought to be considered by those putting themselves in situations where they are photographing the vulnerable and the suffering. Photographs such as the ones taken by Carter are valuable, but we must avoid being merely an observer. We must, at the very least, learn from such photographs, and if possible, alleviate the situations presented to us. Carter was able to succeed in taking the photograph that provoked such a strong emotional response as to encourage many more to help the millions affected. Perhaps the question as to what Carter did to help the child was not the best question to ask. Rather, it should be what can we all do to assist when presented with the grim reality faced by so many.